Welcome to the next in our whiteboard sessions on the Reformation. Today, the first in a series on the Genevan Reformation. Before we go into what happened in the Genevan Reformation, we have to understand the context. In the early 16th century, Geneva was a small town at the head of the Lake of Geneva. It was not part of France. It was not part of Switzerland. It was part of the Duchy of Savoy, a territory that lay between France and Italy. So there was a Duke of Savoy, and Geneva was part of his duchy, part of his territory. There was also a bishop of Geneva, a Catholic bishop of Geneva, who ran the day-to-day affairs of the city and who was essentially the city's overlord. That bishop was often a relative of the Duke or someone whom the Duke had recommended to the Pope as serving as the Bishop of Geneva. So it was a tight connection between the dukes and the bishops of Geneva. So, Geneva, a Catholic city in the early 16th century. The message of Reformation came into Geneva in various ways. Partly through travelers, through people going back and forth between the nearby Swiss territories and Geneva, partly through books that were circulating. There was a deliberate policy on the part of the canton of Bern that had become Protestant in the 1520s to spread the message of Protestantism through more territories. And they, in fact, commissioned a man called Guillaume Farel, F-A-R-E-L, to come and be essentially a missionary in the French-speaking areas around the Lake of Geneva. And that included, of course, the city of Geneva itself. Farel went to Geneva. He preached the message of the Reformation there to great risk. At one point, he was threatened with being thrown in the Rhone River. He had a colleague, a man called Antoine Froment, who also spread Reformation ideas, perhaps a bit more undercover. What Froment did was advertise that he was running a school and that he would teach people to read and write for free. But the text he chose as his reading text was the Bible. Right? So he gets ideas of the Reformation in that way, sort of undercover, as it were. Between them, Froment, Farel, and others started spreading the message of the Reformation, but it wasn't straightforward. There was quite a lot of opposition. Not surprisingly, the Bishop of Geneva did not care for this message of the Reformation, nor did some of his clergy. Especially, there was an order of nuns in Geneva, known as the Poor Clares, and they strongly opposed the Reformation. They didn't want this. They thought this was ridiculous. They thought it was heretical. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. So it was a time of great unease and tension. There was at one point even a riot in Geneva. Somebody got stabbed. I mean, it's just a lot of violence going on as they're trying to figure out their way forward. By 1533, the Bishop of Geneva fled Geneva, never to return. By 1536, the situation was such that the government thought, the magistrates of the city, who now had much of the control of the city in their hands, thought they had to take some decisions. So in May of 1536, they called together all the voting citizens of the city, and they asked them to raise their hand if they wanted the Reformation. And all the hands went up. Just bear that in mind. Think for a moment who would get to vote and who wouldn't get to vote. Women didn't vote. Non-citizens didn't vote. There were a whole lot of people who did not have the franchise, who did not have the right to vote, and they didn't get a say in this. Furthermore, those who voted for the Reformation may have done so because they didn't want the Catholic Church of their day. But no one had any agreement as to what they were looking for instead. The building up phase was very unclear. For that, Farel turned to a young man who stopped in Geneva overnight in August of 1536, a man called John Calvin. He was just stopping through. He was not staying. He did not bring the Reformation to Geneva, but Farel prevailed upon him to stay and help. So Calvin, who was at this point in time known primarily for his writings supporting the Reformation, became kind of willy-nilly a reformer in the city of Geneva. Those first years of reform in Geneva were difficult ones. They did not go terribly well. There was a time of rising tensions. For one thing, Calvin and Farel decided that they had to kind of make sure that everyone was on board with the Reformation program, so they devised and crafted a confessional oath. And they went door to door, asking people to sign up to it. And a lot of Genevans did not want to do so. They wanted the Reformation, but they weren't going to be bound to anything in particular, so they refused. That was one problem. Second problem, the Genevan's system of church discipline was one that was a bit different from, or at least the pastors wanted a system different from that of the Swiss cities round about them. The Swiss Protestant cities gave discipline to the magistrates, church discipline to the magistrates. The pastors of Geneva, Calvin and Farel, wanted to maintain autonomy over church discipline. Finally, the Canton of Bern saw itself as the big brother in the faith, to show Genevans how to do things. But their model of Reformation and the Genevan model advocated by Calvin and Farel were not the same. Tension rose to a fever pitch, so much so that in 1538, Calvin, Farel, and another pastor were all three exiled from Geneva.